Well, I can see something about you reminded me to turn the mic on. We are trying to shift gears or change our perspective from last year when we spent the entire year on one story and one set of outlooks on the origin of evil. And to shift gears or to change perspective, we have chosen to look at a classic or at a classical case of perspective shift. Classical in that it comes from the Platonists, and it's called the problem of the one and the many. And it is sometimes called the problem of the unity and diversity, passing from unity to diversity or from diversity to unity. What we did is we started out with a very simple little gimmick to show some of the problems of perspective shift. We drew two concentric squares. And we connected them together with diagonals from vertex to vertex, or vortex to vortex. Is it vertex to vertex? And we said that you could have two perspectives on it at least. One, you could see it as a bird's eye view of a flat pyramid, or two, you could see it as looking down a deep chute, or an inverted pyramid that is depressed. When we looked at it, we looked at some of the problems of attachment and the exclusive kind of consciousness that comes when you are in diversity, when we're in the realm of the many and of separative consciousness. Then it's hard to have unified consciousness. We tried to vaguely intimate that there was a state of conscious unity wherein one could be conscious of both perspectives at the same time, but not trying to necessarily to look at either, but being focused in that state of unity. And all of the other perspectives would be within that. And we intimated even more vaguely that there was a kind of unity, or a deeper state of unity, wherein differentiation of any kind was just not thought of. It was all negligible or non-existent. A state of unity that was complete and perfect oneness. And so we have looked at a little of that through a very simple geometric optical illusion. We then shifted to the problem of conscious shifts from unity to diversity by looking at incest myths in creation myths, autogenesis myths. And what we're doing is following a series of stories from the most ancient times, from the Vedas down to the Puranas, and following autogeneration myths within that. The primary intent is to understand or get the experience of a shift of consciousness, a shift of perspective. And there is a secondary intent to follow historically how the shift occurs in the evolution of religion, in the evolution of society, and the philosophical outlooks as they come along from century to century. Now, some people have found the telling of these stories, which are told in very down-to-earth human ways, some people have found that unpleasant. and more or less feel that that is speaking of something that is a sacred unity, and that any rendition of it in human terms, especially sexual stories, is just not to be done, because that is not doing justice to the ineffable unity. It's too sacred and it's too holy to even consider things like that in other terms. If you are among those that feels that way, and it's a very reasonable feeling to have, it's probably an indication of success in spiritual endeavor that is more apparent than you might suspect. If someone is in rapport with a state of unity, or is actually in a state of unity, to try to shift the perspective to the state of differentiation, to the state of the many, feels uncomfortable. And it feels unpleasant, because that's one of the problems, is we become comfortable with an outlook on life, and it's always difficult to leave what we're comfortable with. And in fact, what the shift of consciousness that we're talking about from divine unity into manifest creation, and a manifest creation with all kinds of imperfections in it, is a very difficult thing to endure psychologically if you're going from that state of unity and actually living into something that is very limited. Who would ever want to leave an unlimited state to go into one that is increasingly limited at all? You know, it's a very unpleasant thing. So if you're uncomfortable with it, it's going to feel like profanation. It's going to feel that what should be adored is being mocked. But this is exactly the problem. If you're feeling these kinds of experiences, that means you're living through the same problem that the storyteller has of taking a very, very far distant spiritual state and bringing it to human consciousness so that human consciousness can be inspired to turn in that direction. And so it's, all right. It's one of the problems, the problem of feeling uncomfortable about the manifestation at all is inherent in one of the myths that we talked about last time. In fact, we're going to go back and tell that story again, just very briefly, because we missed an extremely important point and one that was very relevant to what we're trying to do. But somewhere along the line, we were going to move. We started out with a story from the Vedas, and then we went to a story from the Brahmanas, and next we were going to go to the Upanishads. But Sharad got to me in the meantime, and that means we get an extra story, which will make up for the rest of the year when we won't have almost any stories. Right now, I am dealing in my collection of stories from Hindu myths and scriptures. I have only little fragments from the huge corpus of literature that there is on Hindu myth and scripture. The translations I have are reasonably good, and but they're just little bits here and there. I would like to remedy that, and that is I would like to have very good translations without cultural bias, either Eastern or Western, of all of the major texts, especially the kind of translations that give you variations of interpretations or variations of translations of it. this passage could be saying this, or it could be saying that, or it could be saying that. And if anybody, I'm willing to pay for the books because I'm trying to develop a mythological reference library. And if anybody would like to help, Charlotte is going to help some to find collections of all of the things that I'd like to get. But if any of you have any good suggestions, I would be most appreciative for it. Charlotte happens to have a modern, pretty good translation of the complete of the Upanishads. And he suggested a story that actually follows the historical story that we've been following all the more. In fact, it even refers directly to the story that we just saw in the Brahmanas. And we'll look at that first, and then we'll go on to what I was going to look at in the Upanishads. We'll only do a very little bit of it. Oh, my goodness. Could I possibly have done that? Yes, I did. I'm going to have to break for a second and get the text to read. This is not exactly my favorite kind of translation. It's pretty earthly. It's very, very well thought out. I guess a whole lifetime of study before actually being put into print. The man is here now, and he can tell us all about the translator. But we'll read just 6 verses of it. It is a procreation ceremony from the Brahad Aryank Upanishad. Yeah, it's based on a cosmogenical myth. The earth verily is the essence of all these beings, meaning the spiritual beings. Of the earth, the essence is water. Of water, the essence is plants. Of plants, the essence is flowers. Of flowers, the essence is fruit. Of fruits, the essence is the man. Of man, the essence is semen. And Prajapati thought within himself, come, let us make a firm basis, abode for him. So he created woman. Having created her, he revered her below. So one should revere woman below. He stretched out for himself that which projects. With that he impregnated her. Her lower part is the sacrificial altar, her hairs the sacrificial grass, her skin the soma press, the 2 labia of the vulva are the fire in the middle. Verily, as great as is the world of him who performs Vachape sacrifice, so great is the world of him who, knowing this, practices sexual intercourse. He turns the good deeds of the woman to himself, but he who, without knowing this, practices sexual intercourse, his good deeds turn women into themselves. This verily is what Udalak Aruni knew when he said this. Verily this is what Nak Madgalya knew when he said this. Verily this is what Kumar Harata knew when he said, I shouldn't put the last A on there, when he said, many mortal men, Brahmins by descent, go forth from this world impotent and devoid of merit, namely those who practice sexual intercourse without knowing this. If this much semen is spilled, of one asleep or of one awake, then he should touch it, or without touching, recite, whatever semen of mine has spilt on the earth, whatever has flowed to the plants, whatever to the water, I reclaim this very semen. Let vigor come to me again, let luster come to me again, let glow come to me again, Let the fire and the altars be found again in their usual place. Having said this, he should take it with his ring finger and thumb and rub it between his breasts or his eyebrows. Now, if one should see him, his reflection in the water, he should recite the following hymn. In me may the gods bestow luster, vigor, flame, wealth, and merit. This verily is the loveliness among women, when she has removed her soiled clothes. Therefore, when she has removed her soiled clothes and is so lovely, he should approach her and speak to her. And it goes on from there. It gets very bad. Exceedingly bad. Probably several centuries have transpired between the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, and we can see in this story a lot of things have changed. A lot of things now are much more written out or spoken out intellectually. It's much clearer. The creation of the daughter woman is now stated as an internal, a mental kind of process. That's very clear. And that the process of creation, like the process of turning the energy into the material world, which is a parallel process, is a downward and outward process. When it's talking about looking at the nether parts of a woman and looking downward, it's not just talking about some physical voyeurism. It's talking about the direction of consciousness into the receptive, that is, into the elements of the world that receive things and are impressed with creative consciousness. It's interesting to see that what we looked at when we looked at the Vedas, and we said that what the Vedas were calling an erection was actually an extension or projection of objective consciousness. And now that we get to the Upanishads, that very thing is stated, that which is a projection. It's made it very clear. Some things are not clear in this story because there's a lot of religious dogma and ceremony. There happens to be a lot of tantric magic in this. In fact, a good deal of it, if you read really closely and follow it with inner consciousness, is talking about opening up inner states in the same kind of consciousness that one approaches sexuality. It's of multiple purposes, the story. It has a lot of human weaknesses in it. In fact, there is even misogyny in it. Misogyny of the worst kind, even talking about beatings of women and things like that. And in some places there are even statements that I at least consider outright black magic, and it's put right in there. That's what happens when you become religious. In the distraction of the material diversity, and nothing, I guess, is more distractive in human material diversity than sexuality, it's not easy to discern that the various private parts represent various states of consciousness, and that entering into various parts one is entering into a state of consciousness. It's not really easy to see. And the same thing when it talks about calling back the semen to yourself in that little hymn, that is actually has to do with a very esoteric thing of a germ that passes down the spine and then back up, and calling it up and putting the fires into their altars has something to do with the focusing of spiritual energy into various centers, either chakras or vortices or something of that nature. It isn't, they don't go into all of the details. And it does not go into the process of how in the process of penetration is a passing into and a passing through the material world, and again cyclically returning to something that is spiritual. So there's a lot of things that are in the story that aren't told, that are very important things that we're not going to go into. In fact, from here on in, we're just going to look at stories and we're just going to fly through them in a big hurry, and have a few things to say at the very end. This was all meant to be done in one talk, so since we spent a whole hour and a half last time, it probably will be just about an hour only this time. The Upanishad that I selected out of those that I had is a different one, and it shows a consciousness that is very different from where we began with the Vedas. The Vedas represent a kind of consciousness that's almost detached from the physical world altogether. It is so inward and it is so otherworldly that when things are spoken of, objects, everything in the world is looked at as a symbol, and in a way that the material world isn't even that much looked at as a reality. It's a consciousness that is extremely foreign to ours. And that's the kind of perspective shifting that is very hard to do. There is an illusion that happens with consciousness, that when we become conscious, we know that there are truths, or that there is a spirit of truth that runs through us and that runs through our consciousness, and it's something that we can communicate with others in that same spirit. And so we realize the universality and the unity of consciousness. But what we don't realize is that it hasn't always been like this. Sometimes when we enter into a higher state of consciousness, we say, how could I have forgotten this? Or how could I have put all of my attention into such dark and dull consciousness? But then once we're in it, it feels natural and feels like it's always going to continue like this. One of the problems about this is that we then think that it has always been this way, that everybody has had the same kind of consciousness, which is not true. Different people at different beings at different times in cosmological history have different qualities and different degrees of waking consciousness. And what we have now, especially the ability to ratiocinate and to do everything on the basis of doubt, like somebody who wrote the Vedas had no conception of doubt at all. There was just so much trust and so much belief in the obvious reality of spirit that to think of doubt would, that's just something that didn't enter into that kind of consciousness. And so as we're going along, what we're trying to do is show a shift in perspective that takes place with a shift in consciousness. Things move much faster now, and there is much more, instead of a spiritual consciousness without a good deal of rationality, but just stating, they're just cosmic truths were just stated in the purity of the nascent human spirit. Now things are much more abstract, and there's a strangely beautiful psychologic in it. The story goes something like this. In the beginning was soul spirit, Atman, in the form of man, or one, or self. He looked around and saw nothing other than himself and said, I am. And I was born, which is why we identify ourselves as, it is I, Richard. Then he preceded, since he preceded this universe he burned up all evils. It's very abstract. I think this is talking about evils, in this case, is synonymous with chaos. That all of the chaos was burned up by a unity. Who knows this burns up anyone who would precede him, meaning to say a flat consciousness. There cannot be another greater than the one, because then it would be the one. And it's like saying that God transcends God to God. And it's a very extremely logical. He goes on, he was afraid. One who is alone is afraid. And he says to himself, since there is nothing to fear, of what am I afraid? And fear vanished. One becomes afraid of a second. But without a second, he does not rejoice. He desired a second. He was the size and shape of a man and a woman, and he caused himself to fall into two, literally to fall into two. It is said oneself or one's person is like a half fragment. They united man and wife. She reflected, how can he unite after engendering me from himself? For shame. And she concealed herself. And here transpires all of those metamorphoses. She concealed herself as this, and he became the male counterpart of that. And so all of the creation came about as a series of unions or attempted reunions of one that has divided itself to have someone to rejoice with. It goes on with a whole long string of such metamorphoses, which we don't really want to go into right now. And then it ends up with something very, very beautiful. One of the most beautiful things I've ever read in any story in my life. This is the surpassing creation. For Brahma created gods who were better than him. Who knows this is born in that surpassing creation. Beautiful, beautiful thing. It has the whole notion of progress. I have never seen it stated more beautifully anywhere in a creation story, where as a result of even the imperfections of manifestation into diversity, the experience of that and the carrying out of the creation into all of the not always so pleasant details is results in something better than was before the beginning of the creation. Very lovely, lovely thing. It even seems to imply that being alone and basically adoring yourself, or being alone with your own conceit, your own imagination, is fruitless. And it's only when things are carried out that they become surpassing creation. Very lovely thing. Now I want to move. I'm not going to make any more comments. The story stands for itself. It's very lovely. I'm just trying to get to an idea. And I want to tell one more story. This is a few more centuries further in history. This is from the Mahabharata. And it's a very long, elaborate story about how Brahma creates death. And we're only going to tell parts of it, and we're going to have almost no commentary on it. Basically, the story is an overpopulation story. What has happened is Brahma has made this creation, and it is a very fecund creation, and it is capable of, every part of it is capable of auto-expansion, and more things can be created. And so everything is creating an abundance, and it's pretty soon all of space is overfilled and the earth is becoming overburdened. And Brahm, not knowing what to do about it, torches it, like a flamethrower. Then he lets loose water on it and floods it to put out the fire. And Rudra, who in this case, who's appeared in all of our stories actually, in this case he appears as the pillar. That is the pillar of Dharma, of the great order of things. And he's the demiurge, and he comes to Brahm and he says, he voices his concern. He says, this is no way to run a universe. Even if you're angry about things, that's no way to do things. And Brahm says, I'm not angry. I did it from compassion, because everything was getting too packed. And Ruda says, yeah, that's fine, but that cuts off continuity. And the better part of creation or ongoing creation is the continuity. See, Rudra represents the spirit of time, because he is ultimately the Shiv figure centuries later. And so Brahm agrees with them, and they ponder other solutions. They sit down and sort of caucus about it. And Rudra, not being the extremist all-or-nothing person, suggests the idea of alternation of birth and death. And Brahm thinks this is not a bad idea. And so what he does is he withholds, or he retains within him the fire of his temper, which when manifest was the fire of anger that seared everything. And then out of him you get the image of things oozing or materializing out of all of the apertures of his body. A dark woman comes together out of them. And she has red eyes and red soles and red palms and red garments. And she wears all kinds of spangles and earrings and bracelets. And she is death. And Brahm summons her and tells her what he wants of her. And she's terribly afraid of violating Dharma, the order of things. And if creation is the order of things and she becomes a destroyer or a death dealer, this is a violation of it all. And she tries to dissuade him of her mission. And he's not to be dissuaded. And so she slips away. This is a very long story. And she slips away and she goes into asceticism. Like, for example, she stands on 1 foot for 1,000 million years. And then she spends 1,000 million years praying. And she spends 1,000 million years consuming nothing but water. And then 1,000 million years consuming nothing but air. And all of the time she's finding different hideouts so that Brahm doesn't find her out and force her into this task which she doesn't want to have. And finally she stands on 1 toe praying for 1,000 million years. Of course, all the ballerinas would never believe that. Somebody could be en pois that long, but she does it. And he finds her and sees her, and when he sees her, he knows the whole of her existence, and he knows that she is pure in her asceticism and in her devotion, but he is unmoved. And finally, after she has convinced him of her sincerity, she then has the security so that he can convince her that her action of death will not be an adharma, but that it will actually be something of compassion. and that from alternating states of consciousness or alternating birth and death, that people will advance and life will actually be better for everyone. And finally, she comes to take her mission, and she justly and benevolently causes all things to die in their appropriate time. There's all kinds of commentary we could make on that, but I'm going to pass on almost all of it, because we've just about reached our intended objective. We have observed a change of perspective with a historical development that goes through quite a few stories. We started out with a pure creative urge of innocent incest among unnamed beings, and there was no guilt. As we progressed through the stories, we passed through increasing guilt or culpability about what was being done. Eventually, we shifted from a single creator to multifarious creations, through all those metamorphoses. We went from the one to the many, and we did so with to such an extent that the problem of differentiation with unity was all but forgotten. And the incense becomes distant, and what happens now is that there's more focus on all of the forms and the many, many forms and the necessity for death, which is what happens at the extreme of the many, what happens at the diversity, when the forms become so manifest, so concretized, and so differentiated and separated from their source, the consciousness of the one is lost, and in that there is death. It is like experiencing phenomena. It is like having sensory experience, but not the meaning of what is behind it, or not the unity of what goes through it. There is also a shift in perspective or in consciousness from an innocent maid to ultimately quite a horrifying, scary, bespangled human feminine personification of death. The emphasis has shifted from the spirit to the forms, or to the paturator of forms, who is now the unformer, or the who is now the destroyer. Now I want to go back to the second story that we told last time, because we missed a very important point. It often happens in the heat of things. I get all going with things and then forget some of the main points that I want to make. This is from the Brahmanas, and this is the first time that the single creator is named, and his name is Prajapati. And we're going to tell the same story all over again, only we're going to make one other point and then come back to our notes.
These names are really hard. Can you write some of these names in the board? It's hard to spell.
Yeah, we're missing an awful lot in that too, because the names have at least one meaning apiece, and each of the beings, this is Prajapati. That's a name of a being that is the primal creator, that later, when there is greater self-consciousness, such that beings are named, actually given names, that is the being that later on is known as Brahm. So we'll tell the story all over again. Prajapati comes to his daughter, who is the sky, and then she is the dawn, and then she is a doe. And he takes the form of a stag. And the gods say, he is doing what is not done. they wish for a punisher, but they can't find anybody to punish Prajapati because he is the all-omnipotent. What they do is they assemble the fearful ghost forms, and when they are all united and put together, they become Rudra, or Rudra Bhuta, Lord of Ghosts. I want to put a pest then is the city of ghosts. And and they tell Rudra, Prajapati is doing what is not done. Pierce him. And then he asks for some kind of gift. He says, I'm not going to do this for nothing. I want a gift for this. And it is granted to him, and it is granted to him that he shall be the Lord of all cattle. And he then becomes Rudra Pasupati, or is Pasupati. Pasupati. All right. Over the years, I'll gradually learn how to pronounce. No doubt with a Western accent. Rudra lets fly with a three-headed arrow straight upwards, and when it pierces Prajapati, a great lake of seed is spilt, which is called must not be spilt or must not be spoiled. That's the name of it, actually. Agni surrounds it. Agni is fire, or Agni surrounds it, and the Maruts blow on it, and out of this comes all of the forms of creation. Now, the point that we want to make that we didn't make last time is we said that which is not done, we said that that was actually a pun, a double entendre. And we said that one of the meanings of it was that it was an abhorrence of incest. One does not enter into incestuous relationships. There is, what is the word, endogamy that takes place that is a very terrible thing with incest. The second meaning, or the second entendre, is that that which is not done means to say that this kind of creation, the creative union of the will and the imagination, that is of the manifest cosmic masculine and the manifest cosmic feminine, that kind of creation is not an active, manifesting, projective kind of doing. It happens within, and things precipitate almost like the ghosts that became Rudra precipitate. Now actually, there is a third meaning to that. And this is one that has gone through Indian consciousness for many centuries. The third part of the pun is that which is not done means to say that there is not only an abhorrence of incest, and not only that this is an indirect creation, but that which is not done means to say potentially that all of the whole creation in its manifest form were better left undone. The whole idea, this is the very opposite now of what we just saw with the surpassing creation in the Upanishads. In the Upanishads, we saw the surpassing creation whereby because we get in and participate, everything gets better. But when we're going from the perspective of unity to diversity, if we're going from the one to the many, sometimes there is so much a desire to stay in the unity that there becomes an outlook that all passing into diversity is sacrilege, that it is that which is not done. And so this implies almost that creation itself or manifestation itself is a defilement, is an evil, and that the very act and desire even of the divine beings to create, that is, to go out of the state of unity, is the source of evil or the source of problems. This is really hanging in there with unity. So
what I'm hearing is like saying that the problem of the inbreeding is that you're going to create too many village idiots.
No, that's only on the incest level. We're talking about the same philosophy that says all of this is illusion. Much more severe view than that. It's a view that don't even let just things happen. Don't even think about things happening. It is a view that things were best left in the dream state, or even if the dream is unconscious, or in a kind of consciousness that is a blissful state of non-being. It's that kind of severity. Now, this is something that can happen. You know, there are people that resist anything of leaving of the senses. And there are people that resist anything but their attitude or their outlook on the world. If somebody were to say that these chairs had more green in them than blue, because that's the way they saw them, and they would not look at any other possibility, and it was true because it was from them, in their individual separated state, that's somebody who is locked in the many. That's somebody who is hooked on one vantage point and an identification with one vantage point of diversity, and the whole idea of giving up that kind of consciousness for a more unified consciousness, a more selfless consciousness, is abhorrent. That is the case of going from the many to the one. For some people, it is abhorrent to think of taking this dream, because everybody knows you can never manifest the dream as perfectly as you would like to manifest it, that there is in the unity, there is an abhorrence of trying to, in any way, trying to manifest this. So that's the third side of this has really, really huge implications to it. But it shows, you know, that I'm trying to get at, from at least a few ways, perspectives that we face in going from diversity back to unity, or in hanging on to an atavistic kind of unity so that we can't penetrate, as in the first Upanishad that we looked at, that we can't penetrate this because we can't accept it, and because when we can't penetrate it, we can't draw it back in unto ourselves and fulfill it. Because there are perspective, some people can't see this as anything but a pyramid. And there are perspective locks that each of us has, and it is very important to be able to free ourselves of those kind of perspective locks. Now, except for the very beautiful, beautiful progress that was realized in all of this, in the notion of surpassing creation, there are some very dark ideas which could lead to a kind of complacency. All right, that's one theme that runs through all of these stories. Now, it's not the major one, and it's not the one that we want to look at, but it is there, and it's bringing us to another idea. And I want to look at one more story. This is not a continuation of the incest stories, but it is a creation story, and it's from a few years more modern. It's from the Vishnu Purana, and we're going to tell it for a reason to contrast it from the outlook that we had last year. The story is in the same way that the story that we had from the second Upanishad that talked about, that was very psychological, talking about being alone and the problem of being afraid of another in a competitive sense, but not having another to enjoy in a sharing sense. That was a very logical and psychological story. This one happens to be extremely cosmological, and this one is very sophisticated cosmologically. In fact, to actually go into the meaning of this story, we could spend several years on. The story begins by stating that all creatures and all creators are not released from karma by the dissolution of a cosmos. Meaning to say that if the whole cosmos were suddenly to come to an end and be dissolved, that none of the beings are released from their karma because of that. Eventually, they are all called forth within a new cosmos. And when there is that new cosmos, Brahm performs the creation mentally. And the fourfold beings that extend all the way from divine beings, gods, to inanimate objects are born from his mind, which is also happens to be his body at this state. When he wants to create the four waters, or the four elements, or the four stages of creation, gods, demons, ancestors, and humans, he harnesses the forces within himself, meaning to say he becomes aware and polarizes and brings into focal relationship the diametric forces within his own being. First, the forces of darkness were made active in his body, and demons were born from his thigh. After that, Brahm abandons that body and it becomes night, which is why demons are more powerful and associated with night. He then takes another body that is predominant in good instead of evil, and out of this body, the gods are born and they come out of his mouth. Again, we have the polarization at the two ends of the spine. And he abandons this body and it becomes day, which is why all the creative and manifest work is more powerful and done by day. He abandons this body and he takes another one made out of goodness, but not as high of goodness, and out of it the ancestors, or the Pitras, are born. By this it means the lower hierarchies below the demiurge, not the gods that are beyond the demiurge. And he abandons that body and it becomes twilight. And then he takes another body, and it is a body of passion. And out of this body, humans are born. And when he abandons this body, it becomes dawn, meaning to say we are at the beginning of our evolutionary ascent into divinity. Then he takes another body of even deeper passion, and out of this emanate the Rakshasas, which are all of the nature forces and elementals and beings like that. Rakshasas. And he's angry with this creation, and he's angry, and the hair falls from his head, and these become the serpents. And this cleanses him, and out of his cleansed consciousness, the Gandharvas are born, who are the drinkers of speech. We're in a very complex cosmology. Yes, I think it's, if you're familiar with biblical terms, it is those who live by the word. Drinkers of speech. Probably prettier. Then Brahma created the birds from his youthful energy, and then sheep and goats from the mouth of this new body, and cattle from his belly, and it goes on and on and on like that. This is an extremely sophisticated cosmology, because these bodies, we don't think of them like physical bodies. They are like in what we in modern Western cosmology talk about states of matter, that progressively the cosmos gets deeper and deeper and deeper into matter. And it's always fourfold: 3 descending, 1 turnaround, descending and ascending, and 3 ascending. But the 3 ascending are the same level of depth as the 3 descending. So there are 4 states. And when it's talking about the 4 waters, it's talking about successive quadripartite externalization and densification into matter. It's really very, very complicated. We don't have time to go into it. But there's one point in this that we do want to go into, that we want to mention. And that is the fact that the demons and the evil are shed from the body of Brahma. That is to say that evil and the servants of evil come from Brahma. That this is the natural order of things. That it's like, when you have a dog, somewhere in the dog are the seeds of maggots. And it's a philosophy of the acceptance of discord, of the acceptance of death and destruction right within the very manifest creation itself. Now, this is an extremely, extremely different view than what we looked at last year. In the Garden of Eden story, evil was a potential that one would expect would never occur. One would normally expect that things will go on harmoniously and that no being would ever think of trying to work against the harmony of the very beautiful creation of which we are part. However, in the Garden of Eden story, at their most removed from the state of unity, state of being, both the Lucifers and the humans did intentionally work counter to the divine harmony. So in the case of the Kabbalistic story, the Garden of Eden story, evil is a consequence of a choice to bring in discord out of potential into what is otherwise a harmonious activity. And that at our first opportunity as co-creators, when we are at our weakest, we chose to work against things. Whereas in the story that we've just looked at from the Vishnu Purana, the evil and all of those things are just in the nature of things, and they come right from the first creator. In fact, if we go back to the story from the Brahmana that we repeated this time, to go back into the pun to find yet a third meaning, it is even that the act of creation or the act of manifestation, the desire of that has inherent in it evil.
Desire to create?
Yes.
So the evil is intrinsic?
Evil is intrinsic in creation compared to the unity of unmanifest dream or unmanifest bliss. Now, these are two very different perspectives. One perspective finds that the errors come in the many. One perspective says the errors are inherent in the one. Now, this could potentially be reconciled by the idea of potential, that in what the Upanishad called surpassing goodness or surpassing creation, where things got better, within that there is the potential for them to get better in devious ways. But it's in the state of potential. So the notion that all evil is inherent in things, in Brahm and in the act of creation, when the one separates into many, it might be there only potentially, even though the stories say it is quite an active thing, and in a way an intentional thing.
This word, you're bandying this word potential around, right? Potential, you mean like the soul of all creation?
No, potential is something that could be. Something that could be, but not necessarily have to be. Like in any, if we think just in three-dimensional space, and if we just had an area of three-dimensional space, there's an infinite number of forms that could be manifest in three-dimensional space, but they are there in potential. It's different if that space gets congealed and becomes rock, and somebody takes one of those forms and brings it out in the form of a statue. That is, things have then gone from potential to actual. And potential in terms, it's a much more sophisticated type of potential when you say the potential of discord, of going against the divine dream, which has within itself an integral holiness and harmony, that there is that potential of working against that, because which all of us has, because in spirit we are equals with the one, because we are indeed divine, and that when we can manifest that out of harmony with the whole. This is what we spent the whole year on last year.
Everything changes, but somehow it all seems the same, but it's so different.
I'll pass on that. We're not going to try to attempt to reconcile these two viewpoints. I do believe that they are capable of reconciliation, and I do believe that with spiritual vision we could look at that and see how from different vantage points at different times in the development of consciousness, one could tell the stories these different ways, and these things probably did happen. The only point that we're trying to make is to show the change of perspective. It's just sufficient to conclude that good and evil, or right or wrong, or sin and virtue are something that requires a much broader scope and a much more open to different perspective outlook than we gave it last year. We looked at only one perspective last year, And now we want to be able to look at a different perspective of a totally different way for finding the origin of how evil or sin or things not being done right came into the order of things. We're not going to continue with Hindu mythology. We only use that as a device to show that there are very different ways that the same problem can be looked at, and that there is a shift in perspective back and forth from the one to the many. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into the main thing that we're going to try to look at all year. It's going to be very slow, very hard, and there are going to be few stories, and I might just bring in ringers. I might bring in stories from the Book of Kings and things like that that may not necessarily have to do with the origin of evil in dualism, which is what we're going to talk about most of the year. We're going to start talking now about Zoroastrianism, which is the only purely dualistic religion that the world has known, and we're going to look at good and evil in that sense and see what it does for the dichotomies in our own consciousness and see whether there is something in our spiritual makeup that answers to that or that is at least benefited by such a study. That's it. See, we got done in about an hour, didn't we? Oh, like progenitor.
Progenitor means progenitor.
Okay.
How do you spell that?
Yeah, progenitor. He's saying. Oh, I left the R out. That might be a good sign. What was that?
I mean, all this is going on back in the age of Atlantis, right? All this,
No, the Mahabharata was written A.D. The stories may have been around longer, but the Vedas are first traced to about 1800 B.C. Isn't that about right? But it's so hard to tell because the written language is a very modern thing. The spoken language and the words and the images and the life of the story could have been around for a very, very long time. But writing, which is a very foreign thing, which is one of the worst kinds of materialistic things of all, because the words don't look like what they represent. And they're a very foreign thing to a consciousness that is continuous and a consciousness that manifests through images. Our spiritual creative consciousness is basically an imageic activity, and it is constantly condensing new forms, and there's a continuity of life that goes through them. The continuity that Rudra didn't want to have broken up in his conference with Brahm after it had all been torched. And so to actually write words and then to become literalism from a spiritual point of view, that because this is in print or because I have been published or something like that, is one of the worst kinds of materialism that you can get at all. And so that some people who pride themselves, whether it is extremist Bible toters or whether it is Hare Krishnas, that get very literalistic about the interpretation of sacred works, that's heavy in materialism.
Recent studies done with the Sphinx, the carbon dating of the material, it's much older than they thought it was, like maybe 50,000 BC or something like that. Or it has something to do with explaining the creation of Leo, Virgo, what that is, and the 10 sign.
what happened.
Yeah. In fact, most of the great teachers that started schools, like Socrates never wrote a word. Jesus wrote one word. He scratched it in the sand, at least if the biblical record is to be believed. And Ammonius Saccas, who started the Neo-Orphic school, the Neoplatonism, he never wrote a word. Did it all from that living kind of consciousness. And it is the descendants that get wordy. All right, I guess that's it. Thank you very much.